Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So it's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to Professor Owen Gingerich, and if I may, I'll call you Owen.
Okay.
Tell me when and where you were born.
I was born in a small town in Iowa, in the Midwest of the United States, Washington, Iowa, on March the 24th, 1930.
And Gingerich is a unusual name, at least to me. I know one or two, but not many. Where does this name come from, and your family come from?
It comes originally from Bern in Switzerland, with a G-U umlaut, so it would have been Gingerich, or Gingerich, something like that. And it was, of course, transliterated when my ancestors came. The Gingerich family came to Iowa just before 1850. It was a time of considerable upheaval in Europe, but I don't think they came directly for religious reasons, but it must have been connected.
You mentioned religious reasons. I mean, what do you mean by that?
Ours was a family going way back in the Anabaptist tradition. We were part of the Amish Mennonites, and so was my mother. My father's family came from the region around Kassel in Germany, and my mother came from the Alsace-Lorraine region. That is to say, her ancestors, who came over about the same time. Now, the Mennonites are a pacifist group. They believed in adult baptism, which meant that they were despised both by Catholics and Protestants, who were keen about baptizing anybody in a region into the religion of the emperor or the duke or whatever. So a group of Mennonites were coming over to America at that time. I don't think necessarily because of their pacifism or that they were about to be inducted into some army, although many of the Mennonites or Amish did emigrate for precisely that reason.
Well, I think I've heard that they were mainly farmers. Is that right, or?
That's correct. It was a rural part of Iowa into which they were coming, and they had been farmers in Europe. Although one of my direct ancestors owned a mill, and I went to see it one time when we were doing tourism in Europe, and as the oldest son of the oldest son for some generations, it would have been my mill. It was, as many of these things are, converted into a restaurant, and had I been able to speak German more fluently, I would have asked for a free meal.
Tell me something about your parents, because I think they were very influential on your life.
My father was born some distance north of Washington, and my mother in a small town south. They somehow met in some of the youth religious gatherings, and they got married in a church service without having announced it to any of the family or friends. Just happened as part of the service. My father was a school teacher, and my mother was too for a short while. So during my youth, my father was working on his PhD, which I have to say was quite unusual because of his several siblings. None of them even finished high school. But he had one of his uncles, who was a great role model for him, had in fact become professor of English at the University of Michigan. So that was somebody that my father admired and was emulating. And working part-time, he managed to finish his doctorate at the University of Iowa in social history, social American history, writing a thesis on the Mennonites in Iowa. During that time, he visited every Mennonite church in Iowa, including the Amish churches. He was originally in an Amish Mennonite family, which the whole church left and became Mennonites when he was a teenager. So we were always just Mennonites and not Amish. But it is interesting that, well, the son of the University of Michigan professor and another person collaborated in producing a huge genealogy of the Amish Mennonites, which has been of great use to the Johns Hopkins genetics researchers, because particularly the inbreeding of the Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, has produced many genetic pathologies. So this is an interesting book, and one which I've been able to use fairly effectively at various times. When the National Science Foundation sent me a fund proposal to referee on a topic I knew absolutely nothing about, I figured, well, there must be another Gingerich out there. and indeed, this is the case. A distinguished person who's looked after the whales, fossils, at the time that whales had legs. So I looked him up in this genealogy book, and we're some sort of cousins, I think second cousins once removed or something like this. Another person whose name whose ancestors I found in the same book is George Gallup Jr., the famous Pole man. But I couldn't prove that we were any kind of cousins.
Tell me something more about your father's influence on you and what sort of person he was.
Well, he was quite determined as a scholar, and he was away, of course, a lot when I was a youngster because of his working up in Iowa City on his thesis. I remember sometimes he would take me up there on a Saturday and turn me loose in the Natural History Museum, where I was really quite terrified wandering alone among the stuffed lions and the cottonmouth snakes and so on. But one benefit I had was that sometimes he would bring books back from these travels, and he saw that I was rather interested in the stars. My mother said that my interest went back to when I was 5 years old. On a very hot night, when it was so hot in the evening that it was still 100 degrees Fahrenheit inside the house. So she took cots out into the backyard. I think my father was away on his thesis at that moment. And I am said to have looked up and said, "Mommy, what are those?" And she said, "Well, those are stars. You've often seen them." To which I replied, "But I didn't know they stayed up all night."
It's a lovely story. He brought back these books. What can you remember the titles of any of the books or what they were like?
One that I treasured for quite a while was entitled A Beginner's Star Book, because it showed where to look and what you would be able to see with binoculars or with a small telescope. And my father got another book that told how to build a simple telescope, which he did with a mailing tube, with a lens which he got out of a box of lenses that the local optometrist had lent to him, and an eyepiece from the local dime store. And it was a good enough telescope to see the rings of Saturn. And I remember with great pride showing them to my 5th grade teacher. So that really got me a start in astronomy. But I wasn't limited to that. I was always picking up rocks or fossils or other things.
You were a collector?
I was a collector.
Because this may relate to your collecting books later on in your life.
Yes, and shells and other such things. We still buy the occasional ammonite. We have a splendid coffee table that has 100 ammonite fossils in it from Morocco. But, well, let me continue the story, because my father was interested in the Mennonite tradition, in the pacifism, and also during that time very much concerned about what was happening in Germany. And he spoke out against the persecution of the Jews, which was a little strange thing for Washington, Iowa, a town which, as far as I know, had no Jews, had no blacks. It was a very solid white Protestant society there. And not all of his talks went well with the more militaristic school board. He was a high school teacher, and the school board decided that with his PhD he was overqualified as a high school teacher, and that they should sort of push him along, and so declined to renew his contract. And this caused a family crisis, because it was during the Depression in America, and it was terribly hard to get an academic job. He had various possibilities. One after another fell through. The end of the school term, they didn't know where they were going to turn, and my mother essentially had a nervous breakdown. Manic depressive illness. She was taken away to a state mental hospital, and very soon while there she got a terrible, terrible streptococci infection, which was threatening her life. She was transferred to another hospital, and she always said that the high fever she had literally driven the mental illness out of her. I always thought that was a rather fantastic story, but when I was an adult and had a chance to talk with a psychiatrist, he said, "Oh yes, this is a well-known property, but it's a little dangerous to induce a very high fever into patients in the hopes of healing them."
How old were you when all this happened, when your mother had the breakdown?
I was 10 years old.
So it must have affected you very deeply.
Yes, it did, of course, because she was in the hospital for a long time recovering. And needless to say, the school board very hastily renewed my father's contract.
It did? Oh, well, that's honourable. Good.
But my father realized he was in an uncertain kind of a position. And when very abruptly another job offer came through, within 1 week, we packed ourselves up and left to Kansas. I remember because that summer, partly as part of my mother's rehabilitation and so on, we had taken a long driving trip all the way to the West Coast. But in the process, we had completely circled the state of Kansas. I had been in school for a week, and I came home, and my parents said, "How would you like to go to a state you've never visited?" And I instantly said, "Kansas." And they said, "Yes." And within 1 week, we had packed everything up and had, with a large trailer of household goods, headed off to Kansas.
You had brothers and sisters, or?
I had a younger brother who was 4 years younger than I was. So it was the four of us in the family who went out there.
What was your mother's character like, I mean, when she was well?
She was very artistic. She often did crafts. of different kinds, and also some creative writing. She was basically a homemaker. She did not have a profession after being a country school teacher for a few years. She had a couple of years of college, and that was enough in those days to teach. While she was pregnant with me, she passed her Red Cross lifeguard swimming exam, a result of which was that on several occasions she served as a camp swimming instructor. So we went up to Michigan from Kansas a couple of times for that. My parents were much interested in a balanced life, which included a certain amount of recreation, so we often played games together as a family.
But you spent a lot of time swimming before you were born. Did that lead to an interest in swimming later on or not?
I'm not a very good swimmer, but while I was up at the summer camp, I did learn how to swim.
Tell me about your schooling. What was your first school? Do you remember?
I just went to a public grade school there in Washington, Iowa, and then went into public school again when we moved to Kansas. But the interesting thing about this was, after going through junior high and high school almost, when I would have been a senior in high school, my father got another job offer, which was very tempting to him, so we all packed up and moved to northern Indiana, and where he then headed a Mennonite Research Foundation. I didn't want to go into a new high school in my senior year, and since I had worked diligently, I went directly to college because we were in the town with Goshen College, a Mennonite school. So I never graduated from high school until just a few years ago, when I was working on a book. Harvard Magazine interviewed me, and I said somewhat facetiously, if my book makes me famous, maybe I'll get an honorary degree, such as my missing high school diploma. And within 6 weeks, I got a call from the superintendent of schools in Newton, Kansas, where we had lived, and he said, the school committee has voted to give you an honorary degree if you will come for commencement. I asked my book publisher, and he said yes, he'd pay for the trip.
Ah, lovely. What a nice story.
As I say, it's going to be a long time before I have my 50th high school reunion. But there's another part of the story that I had better tell you.
Yeah.
And that is that during World War II, this was the time when we were living in Kansas, my father, as a teacher, was not in the age limit to be drafted, but many of the Mennonite young men went into what was called civilian public service, which was camps for doing environmental work, and many went into work as orderlies in mental hospitals. Their stories of what was going on in mental hospitals eventually helped catalyze the nation into giving up many of these rather horrible institutions. So my father went around to visit these camps, giving lectures and gathering information, because he figured as a Mennonite social historian, he would probably be the one to write the historical account of what was happening. It was very interesting, because the men who went into the church camps were conscript laborers. They got no money from the government. The church had to pay for their food and clothing and maintenance. So it was an interesting situation, but that's not part of my story. Part of my story is that my father well, during the war, there were very little opportunities to travel. And suddenly, at the end of the war, my father saw a huge opportunity for travel. Namely, that the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration was going to be sending shiploads full of horses to war-torn Eastern Europe, and that they were going to need supervisors for the cowboys and cowboy crews. And so he went and took the examination for the UNRWA supervisor and got appointed, and meanwhile began recruiting young men to be cowboys from his friends all the way across the country. When we had our 50th reunion of the cowboys, the question was, because by then most of us were grandparents, how in the world did all these parents allow 16 and 17-year-olds to go off address unknown for 6 weeks, or an unspecified length of time? It was different then because many young people had been drafted during that time. But it was, everybody agreed, confidence in my father as the supervisor of the group. So there were 32 of us. I was not the youngest one, but I was the minimum age, 16, to get a merchant marine card showing that I was a cattleman. Not that I had had any farm experience. My cousins were mostly living on farms, but we weren't. However, I was a fast learner. We went to Poland with some 800 horses, leaving from Newport News in 1946, 1 year after the war in Europe had finished. And let's see, do I get that date right? No, it must have been maybe 47, because the war in Japan lasted through the summer of 1946. Or was it 40?
45, I think.
No, of course, I was 16. It had to have been
46.
1946.
Yeah.
So we went on this reconditioned, re-outfitted Liberty ship with the horses in stalls on the upper decks, in the holds, all the way down 3 levels in the middle of the ship. And we sailed through the past the White Cliffs of Dover. We stopped in Plymouth because we had had trouble with the refrigeration and we needed fresh food. And we went and saw the bombed out church in Plymouth and so on. It was our first encounter with the war damage that we had only heard about in the newspapers. We went through the Kiel Canal. The very patriotic American pilot would not have a German pilot on board for crossing the North Sea, which meant that we promptly got lost in the worst minefield of World War II. We saw enough mines to be terrified. The ship just crept through with one sailor with binoculars right on the prow of the ship, scanning. I remember once being in the aft and suddenly seeing the foam that we were making a right angle turn, and several of us rushed to the side to have a look, and we saw the mine come floating by that had been dead ahead before we made the turn. When we got to Gdańsk, or actually Nowy Port, which was the Polish port there in northern Poland, we offloaded the horses, but at the same time we got our first glimpse of the horrors of war. The prostitution, the black marketeering going on the wharfs, the piles of brick rubble that constituted Gdańsk, or Danzig as we thought of it then. It was quite an experience. On the way back, the ship stopped in Copenhagen for about 6 days. more repairs needed. And one of my buddies and I, who were interested in science, found the Copenhagen Observatory. A very hospitable woman opened the door for us and told us about it. Her job was sending out the astronomical telegrams for announcements of comets or novae or so on. Well, never in my wildest imagination could I have thought that 18 years later I would be taking over her job, essentially, and moving the Telegram Bureau from Copenhagen to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I was by that time. This whole episode of going to Poland very much influenced my life in completely unexpected ways, because when I was in Europe to do the transfer of the Telegram Bureau, it was a meeting in Hamburg of the International Astronomical Union, and I met a young scholar, an astronomer from Poland, who was getting interested in the history of science. And I told him the circumstances under which I had visited his country. And he said, "You must come and see it now." He said, "What about next year? The International Union for History and Philosophy of Science is going to be meeting there. Why don't you come to this international meeting?" So my wife and I went, and it was quite wonderful to see much more of Poland, to realize that the Polish scholars were so much looking forward to the quinquacentennial, the 500th anniversary of Nicholas Copernicus in 1973. And one thing led to another, and I got on the International Committee to work on the Copernican celebrations. Of course, I've taken a mighty leap now to the late 1960s, so you're probably wondering what happened in the meantime.
Well, what is interesting, I mean, these things don't necessarily need to be sequential, because this is a thread of a story which it's very important to see the leap across to working on Copernicus. But perhaps we'll come back to that and then move on along that chain a little bit later, because even we've leapt over your schooling, which is often a very interesting period. Were there in any of your schools any teachers who you remember as influencing you particularly?
I think very much so by a couple of them when I then went to college, because one was the chemistry professor. I became a chemistry major because that was the best organized physical science. The mathematics and physics professor did not offer the courses every year, because in a small school like that, there weren't that many physics majors.
I ought to explain that school is used in a different way in America and in England.
Okay, I was in college.
Yes, school for us is, up to college is beyond that. So you're talking about college, yeah.
I'm talking about college.
Yeah, and the chemistry professor. Who was he? What was his name? Do you remember?
The chemistry professor was Glenn Miller, and this was a boyhood friend of my father's. They had gone hunting together in that southeastern corner of Iowa, and they were unusual out of their community. There were two of them who went ahead and got their PhDs, and a first cousin of my mother's, who was a woman, became one of the very first Mennonite women to get a PhD. So that when we arrived at Goshen and Goshen College, she was the home economics professor, and Glenn Miller was the chemistry professor, and my father was in the vicinity but not directly employed by the college, although from time to time he would teach the introductory civilization course for them.
So you majored in chemistry, did you?
I majored in chemistry, but I took a lot of physics. I took about as much physics as there was. But during this time, I got serious and built my own 8-inch reflecting telescope by grinding the mirror, by getting the castings made for the mounting and putting it together. So it was a pretty decent instrument. While I was still in Kansas, we were living on the campus of another Mennonite college, and there was a amateur telescope maker who let me use his 6-inch telescope anytime I wanted. So I had some experience in working with a telescope of this size, and this was very interesting to me because I got started looking at variable stars. And this is another little key of my curious life trajectory. I saw that you could become a life member of the American Association of Variable Star Observers, which had their headquarters at Harvard College Observatory. You could become a life member by paying $50, which was a large sum at that time. But I happened to have got a curious job of washing out the sewers in this small suburb of Newton, Kansas, North Newton, where we live. And this involved filling underground reservoirs with water twice a week, and then pulling the wire to release all of the water, and this great flood of water would go down through all the sewers. There were, I think, 4 tanks to be filled. And for this job, I was paid $25 per year. So I asked the AAVSO if I could pay my life membership in 2 installments, which they agreed. They were rather impressed that somebody that young was prepared to join up for life. When I got to Indiana, to Goshen College, I got very much interested in the Astronomical League, which was the American Amateurs Association. So I went to one of their annual meetings, and it was held in Milwaukee. So I hitchhiked up there, you know, thumbing a ride, and waiting till a car would pick you up, and I got up there. We took a field trip to the Yerkes Observatory, which has the world's largest refractor, 40-inch refracting telescope. And there was an amateur astronomer showing this telescope to our group. And I discovered that he had been hired as a summer employee just to look after the public. The idea that an amateur astronomer could get a job at an observatory was pretty fantastic. And since I had the connection with Harvard through the AAVSO, the Variable Star Association, I wrote a letter to them saying, is there a possibility of a summer job? And lo and behold, I got a reply from Harlow Shapley, who is probably the most famous astronomer in America at that time. I knew that I have, in more recent times, looked up in the index of the New York Times during the 1930s. His name appeared more than any other scientist excepting Albert Einstein. So he was, I got the job. I went as a summer assistant for the most famous astronomer in the country. So once again, I hitchhiked all the way out to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I got acquainted at the observatory. I learned to know who the graduate students were. I saw what would be involved to become an astronomy graduate student. I got a job the next summer at Sky and Telescope magazine, which also had offices there at the observatory. I was very much interested in journalism all of this time. And I figured, in fact, if I would go into astronomy, it would probably be going into astronomy to become a science journalist. Didn't exactly work out that way, but I was editor of the college newspaper and of the college yearbook, so I had some experience this way, and that was very useful when I went to work with Sky and Telescope, because I did in fact know some things about printing and making cuts for illustrations and all that sort of thing.
You mentioned this very famous astronomer. What was he like? I mean, did you work with him? Adler?
He was by this time very much a public figure. He had done a lot for bringing scientific refugees from Europe during the war, but he had made his reputation at Mount Wilson Observatory back in the teens of the century. He was the person who really found out how large the Milky Way galaxy was and how off-centered we were. When he took up the job at Harvard Observatory, becoming director there, he realized that if he had used the southern station properly, they could photograph the Large Magellanic Cloud, which is the nearest external galaxy to the Milky Way, and it would be an interesting study that he would have the best opportunity on. So that was a good part of his research interest. But I did just general hack work of different sorts. I was taught how to make lantern slides. It was one of the first times he was going to teach an undergraduate course, but in the summer school. And so I made lantern slides for his course, copying pictures of different kinds or making them from glass plates. I also was a chief person to fetch the plates for his assistant, who was doing variable star work. I learned how to find the plates because they were filed in this enormous vault of glass plates. I mean, there were 500,000 glass photographic plates dating from the late 1800s, 1880, 1890, and carrying on. So you had to use a card file system to locate the plates, and this was the kinds of things I was doing, fetching things from the library and so on. And I would sometimes work late at the observatory, and Shapley was often working late, and he would sometimes come over and spin yarns about how he had made lantern slides as a young person, but when he got to his first Astronomical Society meeting and saw how professional everybody's slides looked, he went out to a local photographer and had them all made over again. He said he spent all of his lunch money in order to get that set of slides. And as I began to understand more and more about him, I realized that he was that sort of enthusiast and entrepreneur who would in fact do something precisely like that. And he had also started life as a journalist, so we had some other things in common.
Right, well, you've just started going up a particular ladder. You're just finishing your chemistry major.
And that was a very sort of a moment of crisis. This school had a motto, culture for service, and I wasn't sure that astronomy would be of much service. I figured it was about as useless as poetry. Whereas if I continued as a chemist, I could make medicines, plastics, all sorts of good things. But here is where the physics teacher was very helpful. He said, well, if you feel a calling to go into astronomy, you should go for it. he said, we mustn't let the atheists take over any particular field of learning. Now, I didn't fully appreciate the background for his comments, which rather mirrored those of my own father. But many years later, when I became a professor of history of science at Harvard, I had a certain number of honors theses written by the undergraduates. And one of them wanted to write about the science-religion dialogue since World War II. And in his research, what he discovered was many of the more conservative churches were very suspicious of higher education. Even that would have been true at the time when my father was getting his degree. There were too many dangerous subjects out there. And as a result, by the time of just after World War II, many of these leaders realized that they were going to lose the intellectual battle if they didn't send their young people to graduate school, to let them become experts in any number of fields, not abandoning any of them. So anyway, armed with that advice, I went to graduate school at Harvard. It was the only graduate school I applied to. In this present age, that would have been considered a mild form of insanity.
Well, there wasn't any specific hint that it was astronomy was a particularly godless and threatening subject. That I don't know anything about the religious background of people like Fred Hoyle or Eddington or any of these people. They weren't notable for being atheists, or
Eddington, for example, was a very ardent Quaker.
was he?
And one of his students, Cecilia Payne, had come to America and had done a very brilliant PhD thesis with Arlo Shapley, who was just beginning the idea of forming a graduate school. She became Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin and ultimately became my thesis advisor. And she was very sympathetic to the Quakers because of her deep admiration for Eddington. But some of the others, including Shapley and so on, were apt to make wisecracks about religion, and which I found somewhat intimidating. I held my ground.
Well, I was going to ask about holding your ground. I mean, I didn't ask about your religious views at the beginning because of your, the Mennonite background. But how would you summarize There's now a huge amount of debate about the religion-science relationship. How would you summarize your own trajectory in that?
Well, I have become more and more implanted into that dialogue, particularly in the late 1980s. I was asked to inaugurate a lecture series at the University of Pennsylvania on the science-religion dialogue, and I wrote out what I consider my pro-Christian anti-creationism lecture, which was sort of hot topic in those days. And subsequently, I gave that lecture in 40 different venues in colleges and universities across America and Canada. So I became one of those sort of figures when they would say, let's round up the usual suspects to hold a conference.
It's terribly difficult to summarize the whole argument of a lecture, but nowadays it's thought perhaps more difficult to be pro-Christian and anti-creationist. How did you resolve that paradox? I mean, what is the theme of your lecture?
Well, I felt that the heavens declare the glory of God, that you have to look at a very old earth, old universe, because it takes such a long time to cook up the elements required for life. You have a Big Bang, you don't get the iron, the calcium, the heavier elements that you need. And those come out very, very slowly. I was interested in the questions, the general questions of fine-tuning, the whole idea that it is so remarkable, the resonance levels in the carbon atom, something predicted by Fred Hoyle, who said that you have to think that some super-calculating intellect planned this. This cannot have happened by blind chance. So that was a quotation that I used. And more recently, I was invited to give what we call the William Belden Noble Lectures at Harvard, at Harvard's Memorial Church. This is a lectureship that's over 100 years old. And so I gave a series of 3 lectures, which have then been put by Harvard University Press into a book entitled God's Universe. So the press tends to be very conservative, so they didn't print all that many, and it's in its 5th reprinting now. Because it continues. I mean, when you make a new book, typically the sales drop off exponentially, sort of down to 0. But for this book, it's dropped down to a plateau, and then it just keeps selling.
It's what they call a slow burner.
Apparently. So I've been increasingly involved in this set of issues.
So just to summarize brutally, you believe in intelligent design because the chances of it not being designed seem so outrageous.
In the book God's Universe, I said I believe in intelligent design, lowercase I and lowercase d, because I believe in an intelligent creator. But that I am very suspicious of intelligent design with a capital I and a capital D, which I see as a largely political anti-evolution movement. So I am at this moment in the process of writing a book about evolution for mainstream Christians who are very confused about all the debate that's going on. So it will be a different kind of a book in the sense that I'll include a certain amount of historical material and also what the religious issues are, where the theological rubbing points are on this, just to maybe be of some use to people who are trying to figure this out. So I've done a lot of reading, and I've gone to a lot of conferences to get up to speed on this. But it's not that I'm starting from scratch. I taught about evolution as part of my very long standing course at Harvard. Now you may be running out of time on your...
No, we're fine.
Because I did not tell you of 3 of the other characters who have been particularly interesting and influential in my life.
Yep.
Unforgettable characters, I would have to say. At any rate,
Well, tell me about them.
Well, I will tell you about them.
And there's plenty of time, so don't worry.
I was in graduate school at a very interesting time when, for example, the whole distance scale of the universe was doubled with the discovery that there were not 1 but 2 different kinds of so-called Cepheid variable stars. And this happened between my first and second year in graduate school. And then in 1953, I had the opportunity to go to one of the very first summer schools that the newly founded National Science Foundation sponsored. So I was there at Ann Arbor, Michigan, where it was held for 3 weeks. And among the other participants in this workshop as students was Alan Sandage, who became one of the leading observational cosmologists, who had just finished his PhD work at that time. Margaret and Jeff Burbage, who are very eminent Jeff's a theoretical cosmologist and Margaret is an observational cosmologist. And an interesting group of lecturers, including George Gamow and Ed Salpeter, who then went to really renovate the astronomy department at Cornell, and the lead lecturer, Walter Baade, the astronomer from Mount Palomar, who had essentially single-handedly doubled the size of the universe. So this was a very good group. But my problem in graduate school was I was tremendously interested in spectroscopy. But you needed a big telescope to get enough light to get good spectra. And Harvard did not really have a big telescope. So we were more or less at the mercy of what observational data we might be able to get from the West Coast or from the big observatory, McDonald Observatory in Texas, or something from the Dominion Observatory in Canada. And using sort of hand-me-down material is not always the best way to go, because it is, well, if it were that great a material, somebody else would have kept it and worked on it. But meanwhile, the Korean War had heated up. I'm not sure of the dates on all of these things, but I had signed in as a conscientious objector, but I had a student deferment. But some things went wrong bureaucratically, and my draft board was determined to make an example of me. So I was drafted out of graduate school as a conscientious objector, although not until I had had a full-fledged FBI investigation to guarantee my sincerity. As I say, it was a bureaucratic nightmare because of things that I had naively done wrong with respect to the bureaucracy. But by this time, I did know that as a conscientious objector, the most of the opportunities were to work in mental hospitals. But there were certain other approved jobs, and one of them was the possibility of teaching overseas. And by chance, the American University in Beirut which had a long tradition of teaching astronomy, but had lost that during World War II. They were interested in hiring an astronomer and wrote a letter to Harlow Shapley asking, can you recommend somebody? And Shapley knew that I was looking for something and showed me the letter and said, this might be just what you need. And it worked out. After all the hassle, my draft board was glad to be rid of me and send me off to Beirut. Okay, in the meantime, a couple of other things that happened that I should probably fill in. That is to say, I had a girlfriend. I had met her at Goshen College. We both worked on the newspaper together. And she was a nurse, and it happened that she got the offer to come up to Boston with another nurse friend to practice. And so there she was in the vicinity. So we began to see each other quite a bit, and I told her, I know where I'm going to spend my honeymoon. There is this eclipse coming up, and if you're interested in seeing a total eclipse of the sun, you should get more interested. And so that's how it worked out.
This was a marriage proposal, was it?
This was a marriage proposal. And we've been married now over 50 years.
I've met your wife. Remind me of your wife's name.
My wife is Miriam.
Miriam, that's right.
And, well, I guess I have to say that it turned out to be cloudy on our honeymoon. But in the meantime, I think I've taken her to 10 total solar eclipses that she has seen. So I'm typically the lecturer on a cruise ship. And I say, okay, everybody who's stand up now. Those of you who have never seen an eclipse can sit down. Now, if you've seen 2 eclipses or more, you can stand up. But if you've only seen 1, sit down. And gradually you work down, and well, very typically, Miriam is the only one left standing. So that was one thing. And the other was that in my graduate work, thinking I was going to be drafted at any moment did not seem too propitious to get deeply involved in a thesis, only to have to abandon it. So I did, however, get a job as a teaching fellow in a general education course taught by Professor I. Bernard Cohen, who was essentially the founder of the History of Science department at Harvard, and who was a very gifted lecturer and ran a big course for science students, but using the historical approach. And I think Bernard Cohen, despite the fact that there was an intense love-hate relation between us, because I felt he was a little bit pompous and often rather unreasonably demanding without thinking to say thank you. But nevertheless, I learned a great deal about lecturing technique, about how to pace things, sort of what level one should present the material at for the non-science students, how you would go about grading in an equitable way. All of these things were very helpful. There were a group of us who were teaching the sections, and that not only got me really interested in teaching, but also fascinated by the history of science. So I gradually began to do more and more reading in the history of science. I've never had a history of science course, but I am an autodidact in this respect. Well, I got this offer to go to Beirut, to the American University, to fulfill my obligation to the American Selective Service System. So off my new wife and I went to Beirut, and it was a very interesting 3 years. 2 years required by Selective Service, but I stayed a 3rd year because I had things that I was still wanting to get fixed up in their observatory before I left. And also I said I'll stay if I can teach the junior mechanics course. And so teaching beginning physics to rather obstreperous young Arab students was a great experience for me, because I was always intimidated about how I would do in my final oral exam. And in the end, I didn't really appreciate the fact that the oral exam is not to find out what you know, it's to find out what you don't know. And it took them a long time to embarrass me thoroughly. So I must have had one of the longer PhD exams of that period. In any event, I was not happy to have been drafted out of graduate school. But as Kepler said, he thought it was divine providence that Tycho Brahe had left Denmark in a huff, because he had an invitation from Tycho Brahe to go up and see Tycho's wonderful observations. But Kepler said Denmark was much too far away. But when Tycho came down to Prague, which was in range, and Kepler got a job there. He didn't say that he thought it was divine providence that Tycho promptly died and that he inherited all his data. But I suppose it was divine providence that I was drafted out of graduate school, because in the meantime, the Sputnik had gone up. The Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory had moved to share quarters with Harvard Observatory. There was a tremendous burst of growth there, but they also had the fastest computer in New England with extra time on it. And as I said earlier, I was interested in spectroscopy, in spectra, but it was very hard to get the material to use. What happened was that I turned to the theoretical side. I got permission from Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin to switch my advisors. I went with a younger professor who had in fact entered graduate school with me, but with a better background and had graduated very quickly. And he was very interested in using the computer to calculate what we call model stellar atmospheres. That is to say, in detail, the way the radiation flows through the outer layers of a star. And previously, everybody had assumed that the stars were gray across the wavelength regions, so that you would not take into account the different opacity of the atmosphere in the different colors of light. But with a computer, you could handle the whole thing. And so this was, nobody had ever been able to do this before. And I just loved the computing. I ate that up. And so I was soon very deeply entrenched into this cutting edge area. The result of which was that I had a great thesis and a job offer from the Smithsonian Observatory to continue in this kind of work, because they were planning to send up a special satellite to look at the sky in the ultraviolet, and they needed theoretical capability to interpret what was going to be coming out. So I got very much involved in that. And I wasn't involved in that position very long when the astronomy teacher of their basic Nat Sci course, the Natural Sciences course in the general education program, got a job offer and left rather late in the season, and they needed a teacher for the following year. So they asked, would I be interested in doing this? Well, I had had the background with Bernard Cohen, and in fact, when I had returned from Beirut, Bernard Cohen had employed me to be a lecturer in his course. So I did part of the lecturing, and so I had this definite experience of teaching in Beirut, and then also teaching in the Harvard program. So I took over this course, and I gradually worked my way into it, molding it to my own ideas of how it should be run, more and more, introducing much of the historical material that Bernard Cohen had used earlier. This was the astronomy department's offering, not the one that I had originally been involved in. I kept on teaching this and developing it, and taught it for a good long time, so that ultimately when I retired in the year 2000, it had become the longest running course at Harvard under the same management. I mean, the economics course was offered every year for a century, I suppose, but it was always having changing faculty. And during this time I had 100 teaching fellows working with me. I often said that teaching the teaching fellows was my most important job. I've had some of these teaching fellows going on to very distinguished positions, and in fact one of them won the Nobel Physics Prize.
Who was that?
David Politzer, who was, interestingly enough, doing his prize-winning graduate work at the same time he was teaching for me.
You mentioned there were 4 significant people. Your father was one. You sort of implied that...
Bernard Cohen was another,
Yep.
because of his giving me such a foundation for teaching.
Yes.
Well, Bernard Cohen got me involved in another operation. He had become a historical consultant for IBM, and he brought me in on that project, which involved working with the very distinguished designer Charles Eames. So
Yes.
I went out to California fairly regularly to look at the exhibits he was making, like a huge time wall of computer history. And then he did a special exhibition on Copernicus, in which I was sort of the key person, and so on. And Charles was probably the most creative person I've ever worked with, because he not only designed chairs, and to the degree that you find them in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, and the US has just put out a sheet of stamps showing, I think, a dozen different chair designs done by Charles Eames and his wife Ray. So
He was a great chair designer, but also many other kinds of creativity.
he did a film entitled The Powers of Ten, and I'm one of the people thanked at the end of that film, although most people who run the film don't bother to run it through the credit lines.
What would you put his creativity down to? I mean, very simply, curiosity, or...?
It was a kind of curiosity, and such a wide interest in all sorts of things. He made a film simply entitled Toy Trains, because he was a collector of toys, of historic toys and other ones, and so on. But I went on a photographic expedition with him to Poland and to Sweden in connection with the Copernicus exhibition. And I learned a great deal about photography, about seeing things in details, about taking the pictures of books at interesting angles, not just flat on, so that you got more of a sense of it as actually being a three-dimensional object and not just a flat page of text. So a lot of those things I've continued to use. He invented the multi-screen projection show. He did this first in a great way for the US Pavilion at the International Fair in Moscow, and then brought this to a considerable art. As a result, I started showing my slides always double, 2-screen at a time in my class. So he was just an incredible sort of person to work with. For example, he was flying back from Poland from one of the trips, and he realized that if he wanted to get to the nub of what Copernicus was doing, he wanted to show how the Ptolemaic geocentric system gave the same answers as the heliocentric system, but the vectors are arranged in a different way, but they point ultimately in the same direction. And he figured out how to make a model of this with bicycle chains hidden in the background, and within 2 or 3 days of his returning, he had figured out how to do this, and his shop had made this model, which was rugged enough to run for 6 months in the exhibition without breaking down. I often put it as a challenge to my students to figure out how this could be done, so that I could have a model like this too for showing to the class. And no students were ever ingenious enough to figure out how to do it. They could figure out how to do it on the computer, but not with bicycle chains. And the fourth person,
yes.
A very good friend who lived very close to us that I first got acquainted with as a result of some of these educational things for the schools, now in the English use of schools, pre-college level. And that was Philip Morrison, who was an extraordinary polymath, who for many, many years was the book review editor for Scientific American. So his home was always filled to overflowing with the stacks of books that were coming in for review, only a small fraction of which ever got reviewed. And so he had this problem of how to get rid of books. So my wife and I would often go over and write our names in books, which in due time then we would come and collect. So,
and that was his main influence on you, was it? Or?
Talking about just so many different kinds of things. He went out and worked in the Eames shop for a year while he was on sabbatical. Or rather, his wife worked in the shop, and he would come in from time to time and consult with things. I think he was teaching at UCLA or something like that, maybe at Caltech during that year. But he was probably the most unforgettable character I've ever met. He worked at Los Alamos. He had lots of stories about Los Alamos. He came to our house one 4th of July, and our sons had mixed up some fireworks from basic chemicals and so on, and so we had a fireworks show in our backyard. And Phil said, well, I had some experience with fireworks, and of course he was there for the Trinity explosion at Los Alamos, but that wasn't the story he was about to tell. They had to make a test explosion to calibrate the instruments for the Trinity test. And so he said this officer was in charge of these enlisted men who were throwing the boxes of dynamite off the truck. And Phil was about to disappear. And the officer said, no, there's no danger in these. They don't explode in conditions like this. Here, I'll show you. And he instructed the enlisted men to stack up the boxes of dynamite in a wall and to bring somebody with a machine gun to machine gun them. Phil said, I didn't stay to wait for the demonstration. They did ultimately, of course, ignite them all to calibrate the instruments just prior to the test. Well, he had lots of stories like that, and he was the person who flew with the core of the bomb to Tinian to put it together before it was flown over Hiroshima.
Did he have any comments about the ethical?
Absolutely. He became one of the leading members of the...
Pugwash.
Well, yes, but of the movement to ban nuclear weapons. And he was one of the earliest people in to both Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We were once in a restaurant with another physicist sort of talking about this. It was a Japanese restaurant, and the waitress came up and said, "Oh, I'm from Nagasaki." And she just overheard the word. It brought a deathly silence to our group.
I imagine. Let's return to Copernicus. We left the story that you didn't in fact mention the man who, the name of the man, was it Jan?
Jerzy Dubczycki.
Yeah.
And he, over the years, got higher and higher in the Polish echelons, and finally became the director of the History of Science Institute in Warsaw. So I became very friendly with him as a regular collaborator, and he was often able ultimately to come to the States to work with me.
Yeah.
But I saw when I was on this International Copernicus Committee with this anniversary coming up that probably I would be expected at some point in that year to say something about Copernicus. But what in the world could I possibly say that would be new? Copernicus had been studied for some centuries, and the archival materials had been well worked over. I went on a sabbatical leave in 1970 to Cambridge, England, and on a holiday we took the children up to Edinburgh. And on the way I stopped in Leeds with another professor who was also on the International Committee to plan these Copernican celebrations. And we talked about Arthur Koestler's book, The Sleepwalkers, which was a bit of a put down for Copernicus, saying that it was the book that nobody read and an all-time worst seller. And, well, we started thinking about it. Probably there were more people alive at that time who had read Copernicus's book to the end than in all of the 16th century. Mm-hmm. And we started to try to name the people that would have been the readers. Rheticus, the young man who had persuaded Copernicus to publish, Kepler, Kepler's teacher Michael Mestlin, probably Christopher Clavius at the Collegio Romano in Rome, and so on. Tycho Brahe and Erasmus Reinhold, who was the chief astronomy professor in Wittenberg. But we basically ran out of names, about 10 people we could figure out. So we turned to other topics, and 2 days later we were up in Edinburgh, and I went to the Royal Observatory to look at their fabulous book collection. And I took a look at their first edition of Copernicus, and I was amazed to realize that it was annotated thoroughly from beginning to end in the margins of the book. Now, if this book had so few readers, it seemed preposterous that the very next copy I happened to look at would be so thoroughly well read. So I scratched my head about this and wondered, who in the world could possibly have done this? There was no name written in the book, but there was a special binding. In those days, 1543 was when the book came out, books were sold as stacks of paper, and each buyer would have it bound to suit his own taste and pocketbook. And I saw the initials were stamped into it, and I saw the initial ER, and I thought, my goodness, could it be Erasmus Reinhold? And I grabbed a sheet of paper to make a rubbing of it. And when I did it, to my dismay, a third initial turned up, ERS. I didn't know, because at that time I just wasn't deeply into these things, that it was typical in the 16th century to use a toponym, the place where you were born. And he was born in Saalfeld, and that stood for Erasmus Reinholdus Saalfeldensis. So it was exactly right. I had found one of the copies of those 10 people whose names we had suggested as possible readers. Well, this gave me an idea. I thought, maybe I should look at some more copies. It would be kind of interesting to see what people wrote in the book in the 16th century, and nobody's really done this. Maybe I'll have something to say during this celebration. So that's when the great Copernicus chase began. I went back to Cambridge. It was easy to figure out where the books were in Cambridge because there was a printed catalog of 16th century books in the college libraries.
There are about 9 copies, is that right? I think from your book
something of that order, but one of these copies wasn't in the this book because it belonged to Trinity College, which had 3 of them. and they thought that that was too many and they would sell one. But as the price of the book started going up, they realized that if they auctioned it at Sotheby's, it would be in the London Times, and people would think that Trinity was selling off its patrimony, that they had too much wealth already, and they would lose out on other donors. So they changed their minds about whether they would sell it or not. Any rate, one thing led to another, and it became not just a simple research project, but it became an obsession to try to see as many as possible. And it took me 30 years before I was able, finally, to publish the census of some 600 copies of the first and second edition of this book, giving the provenances, the ownerships previous of each of the copies, to the extent that one could figure it out, plus information about what, if any, annotations were in it. And the annotations proved to be pretty interesting. The most interesting thing was this intense connectivity between copies. That if you got a book that seemed heavily annotated, you were almost certain to find another one with identical annotations in it, because students copied their teachers' notes. And for Erasmus Reinhold, there are at least a dozen copies which have some of his annotations recopied into them. But I can't give you more details than this. But after I did the census, I wrote a memoir about it. It's entitled The Book Nobody Read. And my publisher was very nervous about that title. After it came out, he said, "That's an inspired title. It's stopping all these book buyers for the big bookstores dead in their tracks."
It does, because they think, well, maybe I'm the first person to read this book. It's a very good book. I've just started reading it, so I'm really enjoying it. Detective story. What proportion, you said you saw about, or you listed about 600. What proportion?
I couldn't see all of those because I listed a few copies that had been destroyed in World War II. I am now in the position of having seen more copies than can be located, because a number of first editions have actually been stolen, and some have passed through the market to new owners unknown. So I have a considerable record. I've probably seen more copies of that book than the original printer, than anybody since the original printers.
Fascinating. Tell me, you've been very patient, but there were just a couple more questions I wanted to ask you. One was, I've interviewed one or two other astronomers, and I wondered whether you could comment on whether you've met them and whether you know them. One is Martin Rees.
I've known Martin for a long, long time. In fact, when I first went to Cambridge on that trip, he considered me a very senior person in comparison, because he was quite young then. I spent half the year in Cambridge, and then went off to Beirut in the spring semester, because I wanted to show our two oldest sons where they had been born. And when I came back, there was a conference at the Astronomical Institute, and I recently found the group photograph, and there is Martin sitting in the front row looking very young, and I'm standing just behind Jeff Burbage looking very young, and near Martin Ryle, Fred Hoyle in the front row, with Margaret Burbage and Willie Fowler, and Roger Penrose is in that row, and so on. It's quite a distinguished galaxy of people, and I thought, my, what distinguished company I was standing in for that. So anyway, Martin and I have been talking about things for a long time. Every time I go over, I try to go and see him, and he's such a wonderfully patient person. You would think he had nothing else to do.
I know, that is an extraordinary feature of him. He's so incredibly busy, but he always seems to have time to and interest. And but I mean, it may be an unfair or a difficult question. I mean, Cambridge, to me, has two great astronomers, Stephen Hawking and Martin. And when I've asked other astronomers to compare and contrast them, they've been very level-handed, and they've said their styles and approaches are very different. How would you characterize Stephen Hawking and Martin's contribution?
When I was first there on the sabbatical, there was a Thursday luncheon meeting of the astronomers, and Stephen Hawking came quite regularly. At that time, he still drove his own specially equipped car. So I didn't interact with him particularly frequently and so on, but I think he knew who I was because I was somebody who came to the meetings pretty regularly. I followed his work from afar, so he has done several quite brilliant things with respect to cosmology, with respect to black holes and so on. He was obviously not in a position to be the director of the Astronomical Institute, which Martin was. Martin has his finger in just sort of a lot more things. It's hard to compare them as to what their ultimate impact will be seen to be in terms of the pure science. In terms of working as a very effective administrator, of course, Martin Rees is going to make a considerable mark that way. So we enjoy getting together to gossip. We usually have a lot of gossiping to do.
Lovely. The other person who you mentioned, Ryle, but did you know, or do you know Anthony Hewish at all?
I know Anthony Hewish pretty well, to the extent of always calling him Tony Hewish.
Yes.
And so there was, in fact, the time when I had gone over on the overnight flight to London and was walking around in a somewhat of a daze, and it was early in the morning. I was waiting for things to open up, and who should I meet in the Burlington Arcade but Tony Hewish. I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to give a Friday evening discourse at the Royal Institution." And I had heard about those, started by Michael Faraday, well over a century earlier. I said, "Oh, I'd love to come to one of those." And he said, "Well, I'll get you a ticket." So, in fact, I was able to go and hear him lecture, which was a splendid lecture. When I came on my next sabbatical, I told him, I'd really love to give one of these lectures. And he said, "Oh, I'll put your name up." And in fact, I was invited to give one during my sabbatical year, which was a very interesting experience. But at any rate, I have known Tony for a long time, and for a substantial period of time we exchanged Christmas cards. And,
well, it'll be nice to add your interview to his. The last question is a very unfair question, really, but you seem to have had many careers, but in particular two, which is as a very distinguished astronomer and as a very distinguished historian of science. If you had to weigh which you would like to be most remembered for, what would you say? Which has been more important to you, shall we say?
I've always been interested in how science works. What are its claims to truth? How do these claims stack up vis-a-vis religious claims? And it seemed to me very important to do some science so I could understand and appreciate how you handle raw data, how you learn to trust or doubt it. Because when you're working on the cutting edge, things are not clear-cut. Otherwise, somebody would have already done it. But at a certain point, we got a new director at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, And it was George Field, and he was interested in bringing in a new group of X-ray high-energy astronomers to build up a whole new section. And therefore he was sort of wanting to cut down in some of the other areas. And I had a graduate student that I had hoped would be able to come back to a position there and continue to work with me on the stellar atmospheres. And George said, well, you know, if you'd rather just do history, I wouldn't have any objections to that. So I figured, well, if he wasn't going to get me some assistance, I would probably concentrate on the astronomical things. We had the 400th anniversary of Kepler in 1971, and I worked quite intensively on that. And about that same time, I was the lead author of the last astrophysics paper I wrote. Now recently we had a big Kepler symposium in Poland, near the place where Kepler spent the last years of his life. And I suppose about 3/4 of all the Keplerians were there. And they very nicely gave me an honorary degree. And in the citation they mentioned that one of my astrophysics papers, the last one I wrote with a group, had 720 citations. I had lost track at about 500, so I was pretty surprised at that. So it taught me an interesting lesson, namely that the number of citations is a very weak test of the significance of a paper.
That's a very nice point to end on. So we'll just stop there. So Owen, to continue, I asked you the question of whether you would like to be considered primarily as a historian of science or as an astronomer, or whether they were equal in your regard. So I think you thought a little more about that. What would you say now?
I suppose as a historian of science, but basically, as I said, I was interested in knowing how science works. And by doing science, you get some insights, but the history of science gives you a broader perspective, and sometimes it's easier to tease out the meanings of what happened 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago. So I've devoted a lot of time to thinking particularly about Renaissance astronomy and exactly what the relation between observations and theory and scientific proof versus scientific persuasion. And that gives me also a foundation for thinking about the broader questions of where truth lies in religion versus where truth lies in science and so on. So I suppose as a historian of science, my contribution would lie in the work particularly I've done in making the census of Copernicus's book. But I hope I've got further insights into how Kepler was thinking, how Galileo was mapping the moon, and so on. I've worked in 20th century astronomy as well as ancient astronomy. I'm not sure how well read those papers will be, but I hope they've made some contribution.
Coming back to the question of persuasion, you rather counterintuitively argued in the paper you've just presented that whereas I and many people thought that the great scientific breakthrough was the movement from persuasion, i.e. medieval pressures towards believing certain things, towards the Baconian idea of induction and proof. And you argued exactly the reverse, it seems. What exactly do you mean by the arguing this reverse?
Well, there was a lot of argument. For example, what Cardinal Bellarmine told to Galileo suggested that he should look for a deductive kind of proof. To really be sure, to have an apodictic or irrefutable proof, you had to work with Aristotle's laws of deduction. Whereas the way we learn things is basically by induction, becoming familiar with many cases and generalizing in that way. And Galileo was essentially using inductive methods, and he was unable to get the kind of proof that Cardinal Bellarmino was looking for, or that Urban VIII suggested would be required for the Copernican system. In the end, Galileo's arguments proved very persuasive for the Copernican system. If you look in a textbook today, the arguments for the mobility of the Earth would be largely what we call the annual stellar parallax, the movement of stars, the reflex movement of stars because of the Earth's movement, or for the rotation of the Earth, the Foucault pendulum. Yet when those two things were finally discovered as proofs, it was too late in a sense because everybody was already convinced. There wasn't dancing in the streets in that morning in 1851, after which Foucault had swung his famous pendulum in the Pantheon in Paris. People were already persuaded by the coherence and the breadth of Newtonian physics. So in looking historically, I would say that a great deal of how science goes is by persuasion. If you look back 400 years ago to Kepler's great Astronomia Nova, you discover, if you look at the structure carefully, that a great deal of that book is to persuade his audience that he has tried hard enough to get an alternative to the elliptical orbit. And therefore, guys, you better just give up this ancient notion that astronomy has to be done with a uniform motion in circles. That's not good enough anymore.
Thank you. And just another couple of questions. One is the conference we've been to is about creativity and the conditions of creativity. Have you, in your studies of Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, noticed any common themes which suggest why they were such creative scientists?
They were willing to think outside the box. They were willing to let their sense of the aesthetic overrule what seemed to be common sense. For Copernicus, the idea of being on a spinning Earth is ridiculous. And he was afraid of being hooted off the stage, as he said, by people who felt that this was impossible to have the Earth moving swiftly. But what Copernicus had seen was, once he made this transformation to place the sun rather than the Earth in the center of things, then you automatically had the planets arrayed in orbits around the sun, so that the planet closest to the sun, Mercury, went around the fastest, and the one farthest, Saturn, was the most lethargic, and the rest fell in between. And it was a beautiful unifying idea. Suddenly you had the same kind of pattern for each planet, which before was an individual mechanism. And I think it was the power of that aesthetic that won the day with Copernicus. And it took a while before there were other people who were willing to be swayed by that approach and that view, and that somehow that beautiful argument corresponded to physical reality.
Is there any evidence of how these people actually came to these discoveries, in the sense of the lay public often think of scientists as thinking about a problem, and then, as in the famous Eureka moment, suddenly it clicks. They are on a walk, they wake up in the morning, something happens, and it's very, very sudden when the whole thing shakes into a new pattern. Is there any evidence that any of these three worked like that?
Well, I suppose you can trace it that way with Galileo, because Galileo wrote early on to Kepler that he was a Copernican, but secretly. Yet he didn't seem to teach it at all, made no publicity about it, and I suspect he had serious doubts about it until he found out about the telescope and was able to improve it so that he could change what was a carnival toy into a scientific instrument. And when he started looking at the moon and had enough of an artistic background to understand the shadows and the light in terms of topography, he realized that he was looking at an Earth-like object, and that wasn't how it was supposed to be in the Aristotelian cosmology, because the moon and the planets were something totally foreign to the Earth and the terrestrial elements. And I suspect there was some kind of eureka moment. It may not have been one evening, but perhaps a series of evenings in December of 1609. And out of that, he emerged as a convinced Copernican. It's a little harder to figure out when it happened with Kepler, but even as a student at the University of Tübingen, he engaged in a student disputation, arguing in favor of the Copernican system. And somehow that challenged him, and he asked a series of very strange questions, such as, why are there only 6 planets? And why are they spaced out with so much empty, apparently useless space in between, which they didn't have in the nested pattern that was used by the followers of Ptolemy? Well, when he got the idea that maybe the famous Platonic solids, the tetrahedron, the cube, the dodecahedron, and so on, could fit between the planets as spacers, and there were just 5 of these Platonic solids and 6 planets that had spaces then between each successive one. This was a wonderful insight for him. And of course, as he worked it out, he thought that this whole Copernican system represented the Holy Trinity. He was trained as a theologian. He saw the sun, the space between, and the distant stars as the same 3 components that you would get in the Trinity. So it was kind of crazy, but it was apparently part of that extended moment of eureka.
Lovely. I've asked questions which I often ask, and I haven't asked you about music. That's the only question I can think of that I haven't asked you about, really. People talk about the music of the stars, and many people find that their work is inspired or helped by music. Has music meant much to you?
Both my wife and I share very common interests in classical music, and we're great listeners. So we've often gone to concerts together. We have a substantial collection of classical CDs, but we're not performers. It's like a art teacher told me when I was in middle school. She looked at my work and she said, "Owen, you will be a great appreciator."
And who, if you could only take 2 or 3 composers with you, who would you take?
Well, I guess Beethoven and Mozart, and perhaps something more modern, perhaps Schubert.
Are there any questions which you would have liked me to ask you? Is there anything particular that I've left out?
I'm afraid this has been terribly comprehensive. It's a little hard to say. I mean, I have other strange interests. My wife and I have an international class shell collection, and we go after some esoteric aspects of shell collecting, I mean, from certain species. Our collection contains 2 world record size specimens in the Fusinus genus. and it's a specialty collection that we have, and so on. I'm interested in other things. The question of fakes and forgeries, and I've done a certain amount of detective work along those lines. But when I'm really having my nose to the grindstone, it's probably recomputing some 17th century astronomical table and figuring out how a relatively incompetent Dutch astronomer almost drove Kepler's great Rudolphine tables out of the market. Things like that I love to work on.
I've got just one more question, perhaps, which is maybe a little difficult for you to answer. During the conference that we've been to on creativity, a number of those involved, both British and American, have expressed anxiety about the way in which science is going in the States and in Britain. Things like increased bureaucratization, commercialization, use of citations indexes, and so on. How do you feel, looking back over your long time in science, do you feel that the conditions for younger scientists now are more difficult than when you started?
Well, not necessarily. I have had a wonderful group of teaching fellows, nearly 100 of them, who worked with me over the course of my teaching career, and many of them have turned out to be very gifted astronomers and are in secure positions and doing wonderful work. Some of them went off into medicine, some of them went to teaching positions in smaller places, but I think they are doing very satisfying work. One of my teaching fellows, for example, has become a professor at a Christian college in the American Midwest, and with his students has got them into the process of discovering asteroids, and they have discovered maybe a dozen or more asteroids. And he went as a research project after the asteroid that's named after me, and found that it is spinning at one of the fastest known rates for an asteroid, or possibly it's a very close binary asteroid, something that tickles me quite a bit.
Is it called the Gingerich asteroid? Or
yes, that's right.
How nice to have one named after you, and maybe a shell as well one day. Anyway, I think probably that's a very useful supplement. So thank you again for both the interviews.
Well, I've enjoyed talking with you, and hope that maybe my grandchildren will cherish copies of this